What's going on, guys? Today we're going to take a look at another retro gaming handheld. This one is the GKD Mini Plus. It's actually been on the market for a little while, but I'm just not getting my hands on it. So we're going to do some testing, take a look at this thing, and determine if it is indeed worth that $119 price point. As you can see, it's got a pretty interesting form factor and a pretty interesting accessory that you might really need to get the most out of this device, but we're going to kind of look into and investigate that as well. Of course, adding that joystick setup is going to cost you another $20. So at that point, you're not at $120, you're at $140. So with all that in mind, let's take a look at the GKD Mini Plus. So let's go around the hardware here of the GKD Mini Plus. You can see this thing does have a pretty unique form factor that pretty much immediately jumped out to me. I really like the way that this thing looks. It's kind of adorable in a weird way. If we look at our main controls here, you can see we have a D-pad and then a set of face buttons. Now with this D-pad and these face buttons, you are dealing with what feels like a membrane setup. This is not any kind of like mechanical clicky anything. These buttons here are much clickier. Let me kind of let you see and hear what these buttons are like. Not a lot of sound there. You can see what kind of travel you're dealing with there. Kind of on the shallow side. Same thing over here with the face buttons and with these menu buttons. That is definitely much clickier. One weird quirk is that this button is much clickier than that button. Not really sure what to make of that, but that is kind of what those buttons feel like. On the back side, you have your L1s and your L2, R1, R2, all that good stuff. When you're holding it, you can pretty easily reach all of these buttons, hear what they sound like. There is a bit of rattle with those shoulder buttons, but nothing too crazy. You've got two buttons up here on the side that are actually useful for playing games in the vertical format, which you can actually do. Some arcade games are vertical, and that's what those are for. Volume rocker there, SD cards up top, and then your power button up there as well. And it can actually go into a resume state, like a sleep standby state. You can see they're jumping right back out of that. And you have your power indicators up there. On the bottom, a speaker grill, a little lanyard loop, 3.5 millimeter headphone jack, and then USB-C, which is actually very useful for not only just charging, but plugging this thing directly into your computer, transferring files that way. So this device is actually kind of weird because it has two different operating systems on it. If you hit select here, you can see where it says "Go lovely child." And no, that is not it calling me a lovely child while encouraging me. It is actually a Linux-based operating system that you can boot into. Perhaps you like this one better for whatever reason. Shoulder buttons here go through your different folders, different consoles, and you can then launch a game this way. Personally, I think it's probably fine. I'm sure there's some cool things you can do here. I'm going to stick with the emulation station operating system because I think it's just a far better looking setup, but your preference is your preference. This key over here is going to be your hotkey button. If you hold it, you can actually change your volume, change your save state slot, actually save the state. This is a fast forward button. This one pauses emulation. B, I think, takes a screenshot. I'm not sure what X and Y are meant to do. Start will take you back to your main menu, and select will actually reset. It looks like R1 will toggle an FPS view in the top right, which is going to be useful. R2 is going to load your state, and L2 appears to also do nothing. I actually discovered after filming that bit that the same hotkey button and the volume rockers will actually change the brightness of the screen. As you can see there, it's a little bit wonky sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't seem to want to work, and sometimes it does. Not really sure what to make of that, but that is how you can change that brightness on the fly. Wish I had known that a little bit later in the video. This button here on the right takes you into the RetroArch settings, which if you know about RetroArch, you know what you're looking at here. You can change different settings. You can also do your save states, all manner of different things. If you don't know what you're doing in here, I would recommend probably don't do a whole lot of messing around in here. What we can do from here, though, if I click on the right things, is jump back to our main menu, and let's jump into a Game Boy Advance game, and we're going to do our first little bit of testing there. And as we do play this Mario Kart Super Circuit, you can probably see there's almost like a CRT filter on the screen, Game Boy Advance down there, and Nintendo up there. I actually quite like that. We're also going to crank the volume up and use this as a sound test. It should really go without saying, but for the most part, any Game Boy Advance game is going to run really, really well. And as you'll see through the rest of this video, that's where this thing is really at home, is with these sorts of like old school, like retro games. When we start getting into the higher end stuff, the more recent consoles, that's where it's going to really start to struggle, and some of its deficiencies are going to become very apparent. So jumping over to PlayStation 1 now, this is Medal of Honor. I believe this is a game that is playable with no joysticks. I certainly hope that it is. It is a little bit on the dark side, so I'll try and bring this thing up nice and close. The reason I mention joysticks is that there actually is an attachment for this thing that can be purchased that latches onto the bottom and gives you dual analog. That might be really useful for some newer games like this PlayStation console, because later PlayStation games do expect you to have analog sticks. As you can see though, lots of games on PlayStation 1 are going to run just fine. This is Ridge Racer, and we're running really well. Let's actually turn on that frame counter up top. You can see that we're locking right around that 60 FPS mark just fine. Actually was messing around and wasn't paying attention and let these guys start way out before me. Let's just go up and hit them real quick and get them out of my way. No problem at all running a lot of PlayStation games, again, unless you need that joystick, in which case you may run into a little bit of a problem there. Now, when it comes to something like N64, there's a chance it's going to play a lot of these games relatively well. But a lot of games do require a joystick. And yes, you could go into RetroArch and go into your controls, and if you know what you're doing, you could map the joystick to the D-pad, but that's just not going to be a great experience. Rather surprisingly, Sega Saturn actually runs really well. Every game I've tested has been pretty solid on this thing. It does use a different emulation core in it, so a lot of the hotkeys just actually, I think any of the hotkeys actually work, and have to hit select and then do everything through that screen. But if you're a big Saturn fan, like I said, this stuff runs much better than I was expecting. I don't know why I thought Saturn wouldn't run well, but it's pretty good. Now, when it comes to PSP, things are a bit tricky again with no joystick. So I've kind of just like modified my controls so that my D-pad is acting as a joystick, and it's just a little bit of a mess. But you can see with frame skip on, it's actually running, honestly, a lot better than I thought it was going to. Like, this is like almost playable. It does drop a little bit for me. There's some pretty good drop. Like, it's not quite where you'd want it to be, but it's pretty close. As you can see, Wipeout works okay because it lets you use the D-pad out of the box. In the mid to low 20s, FPS dropped really hard there for a second. Let's pause this and we'll jump into the settings. And even with some speed hacks turned on, frame skip, it's just really, it's close, right? But it's just not quite there. One that actually surprised me with how well it runs is the Nintendo DS emulator. This is actually really not too bad at all. This is obviously Mario. I just missed all of the items, my lord. This is obviously Mario Kart. And as you can see here, I'm running absolutely full speed. This is a Mario Kart that I've played much more recently and actually do know how to play a little bit. My only complaint with this is that you have two very, very small screens to be dealing with here. Wario, you jerk. But yeah, as you can see, this is actually running really, really well. Now, it is using drastic, which means this button actually brings up the menu, and this button switches what side the two quote-unquote screens are on. If your vision isn't great, you may have a hard time reading some of those options down there, unfortunately. Now, obviously, games that require a ton of touchscreen controls are going to be problematic and hard to play on this thing. Other games, I forgot the mouse has the key. Mouse? Rabbit, the rabbit has the key. But certain games like this are going to be totally fine. There's even a fast forward button to quickly get through little bits of dialogue and things like that, which is L2 if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, DS is actually surprisingly good. DS, Game Boy. This is basically like a really good Game Boy and like a decent Nintendo DS. Honestly, you could probably go into the settings on this thing and go into your systems and disable quite a few of these because they're just not really going to be worth doing. In 64, without the joystick, you're really not going to be doing a whole lot there. PSP, we're just not fast enough. There are some PlayStation games, maybe there's some that you're going to want to play, but for a lot of people, no stick in the box, no stick on the console, it's just not really all that useful. And while we're talking about those settings, I'll show you some other interesting things. So this thing does have, under its network settings, you'll see Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. So you would think, turn on Wi-Fi, connect to your Wi-Fi, there will be some useful things you could do there. But the most intriguing thing for me was Moonlight game streaming. I could not get that to work at all. Now there is a scraper that's supposed to be able to scrape box arts and things like that from games that you add to it. But I've also heard people having some issues with that. It's not something I really care too much about. Maybe don't expect that to work perfectly out of the box. If you hit select, you can also change your brightness, music volume, and a few other things like that. For those that wanted to see it, these are the specifications. A 3,000 milliamp hour battery. They do quote about 6 hours of battery life. And depending on what you're playing, that is absolutely realistic. I do love the fact that it's got the battery indicator just in lights up at the top of the screen. That's pretty cool. And the standby mode actually seems to work relatively well. Some other devices that I've had in the past, standby really is just turning off the screen, so the thing is going dead pretty quickly while it's sitting there. This seems to be a better, like more proper standby, so that is definitely cool. It is a 3.5-inch IPS display, 640 by 480. It is the, I believe, slightly newer RK3566 processor, 1.8 gigahertz, and it does a pretty solid job. Comes with a 16 gigabyte SD card. You can see the rest of this here. 200 grams is not too bad either. Yeah, those are the specs. So one thing that I do like about this device is the fact that by using USB-C, I can just plug this thing directly into my computer. It pops up and asks me if I want to do USB mode, and I can just drag my ROMs directly onto this device. So I'm going to quickly do that, and then I'm going to show you sort of what the folders look like in case you buy this device from a different place and it doesn't have the folders or ROMs already on it. All right, so this is how mine came. And again, I've seen some other people online saying that theirs did not have ROMs on it and they didn't know what to name their folders, so forth and so on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you this. This is just what the ROM SD card has on it. I'm going to scroll through these and you can just sort of hopefully see the names of all of these folders yourself. These were the ones, again, that were just on there out of the box. I might be wasting my time doing this, but maybe I'm not. I don't think you're going to be doing any Wii emulation, so maybe you don't need that folder. But those are the folders that were on mine. And again, like I said, pretty darn simple for me to just go into a folder and drag my ROMs in, unplug it, and I'm done. So that's pretty cool. At the end of the day, there are some things to like about the GKD Mini Plus. I like the form factor, right? Like, I like that it's kind of small. The screen is really, really good. The speakers are actually really quite solid. The controls are quite good. But in terms of what you're paying for and then what you're getting in return, it's really difficult for me to recommend this thing. And that's because, in my opinion, there are just some better bang for your buck devices around. You could pay $120 for this. You could also pay less than $100 for the Powkiddy RGB20S. Now, this does have a weaker chipset than this device does. This is a faster device. But because this doesn't have joysticks, you can't really use that faster chipset. You're going to be relegated to playing games that only need a D-pad, at least if you want to enjoy playing them. So yes, this device is slower. It's also $20+ cheaper, and you can play those games that require a joystick right out of the box. A lot of N64 games are totally playable here. PlayStation games are totally playable here. Even some Dreamcast games are going to be playable here. Now, like I said, not as well as they would be if you bought this and the joystick setup, but now you're looking at $140, you're really beginning to creep up there in price, because at that point you're starting to creep up really near to some of the Retroid Pocket devices, like the Pocket Flip, which is actually capable of running like even some GameCube games, right? So this device is just sort of in this weird no man's land where the price would make you expect it to be able to do a little bit more than it can. And if you want to get the most out of it, you have to pay even more. But now you're really close to being in a spot where you could just upgrade to an even more powerful device and get way more out of it. So in its base form, because you're only going to be playing these older retro D-pad only games, you kind of have to ask yourself if it's worth paying $120 for this when another good option, the Anbernic RG35XX, is less than $60. And yes, it's again less powerful, because of the controls, you're going to be playing the same sorts of games for the most part anyways. Again, it's in kind of a weird no man's land. So there you go, guys. Those are my thoughts on the GKD Mini Plus. It's a device that I wish I liked more than I did. Maybe this thing should have just come in the box. That would have made it a bit easier to like, but then having to add a thing on to play other games, I don't know. In my mind, this thing probably should have just had lower specs, lower prices, and only targeted lower end games. More like something like this with a nice form factor, a smaller, kind of more cutesy form factor with that really nice screen. Probably would have been a better way to go than to target the higher end while not having the controls there to actually pull it off. Like I was about to say, I do want to say thanks to Go Game Geek for sending this thing over for me to test. As always, no money has changed hands for the production of this review, and they are seeing this review at the exact same time as you are. I will drop a link in the description down below if you do want to check this thing out. It will probably be an affiliate link, which means I will earn commission if you do make that purchase. Guys, thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one, and until next time, stay nerdy, my friends.